Well, good afternoon and welcome to Advancing Clean Trucks, an opportunity to accelerate the transition to zero-emission vehicles. My name is Mary Barber, and I'm the Director for State Affairs in New York and New Jersey for Environmental Defense Fund. While still reeling from the devastating impacts of Hurricane Ida, we know firsthand what the recently released Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report shows, that the effects of climate change are upon us, and there is no time to waste implementing the policies and programs that will help avoid worse and more damaging impacts of climate change. Fortunately, New York's groundbreaking law, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the CLCPA, provides the pathway to reduce climate pollution, spark economic growth, and improve equity and public health. Implementing the CLCPA, as well as investment in resiliency measures, must proceed apace. Transportation is America's and New York State's #1 source of climate pollution. And emissions from medium and heavy-duty vehicles are a predominant source of both climate and toxic emissions that threaten public health, especially in our most overburdened low-income communities and communities of color. Despite making up less than 5% of vehicles on the road in New York, medium and heavy-duty vehicles are responsible for nearly 25% of climate worsening carbon dioxide emissions from the on-road fleet. And the tailpipe emissions from these vehicles are a public health menace that cause widespread harm in New York. But to date, less than 1% of these vehicles are zero emission. The transition to zero-emitting electric trucks and buses offers an historic opportunity to slash these harmful emissions, clean up the air we breathe, and reduce the threat of climate catastrophe. Guided by strong climate laws in New York, New Jersey, and the greater region, the adoption and implementation of policies and programs can lead the clean energy transformation and meet the urgency of the moment. Many of these states have joined multi-state efforts and committed to strong zero-emission vehicle goals for both cars and trucks. Today, we'll hear about many policy options and do a deeper dive into one very important policy that New York has just proposed and that is critical to advancing the zero-emission medium and heavy-duty sector, the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule. We'll hear from our panelists and then move to question and answers and discussion. Audience members are on mute. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A tab at the bottom. And my colleague, Deborah Schneider, is going to help us get to as many as we can. I'm so pleased to be joined today by experts who will tell us about these policies that will help advance the deployment of these clean trucks and buses, and from representatives of 2 businesses that are leading the way putting these clean trucks on the road and what actions they think are necessary to hasten the transition. We have Larissa Kohler, Senior Attorney, Energy Transitions from Environmental Defense Fund, Jennifer Helfrich, Senior Manager, State Policy from Ceres, Stephen Molk, Project Implementation Manager of Zero Emission Delivery Initiatives from IKEA, and James Sherman, Vice President, Climate Change Mitigation Technologies. And with that, I will send it over to Larissa.
Thank you so much, Mary. As Mary said, my name is Larissa Kohler. I'm a senior attorney with EDF's Energy Transitions Program. And I'm going to be talking about some of the federal and state policies that are in place or should be in place in order to accelerate this transition to zero emission trucks and buses. So Deborah, if you can help me with putting up the slides. So I'll start with some of the relevant federal policies that we're looking at. Of course, on day 1 in his term of office, President Biden rejoined the Paris Agreement, an international binding treaty that, among other things, requires each country to set emission reduction targets that are reviewed every 5 years. And as part of this commitment, President Biden has set out to cut GHG emissions by 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. A recent Biden executive order set a goal of having 50% of passenger vehicle sales be electric by 2030, which includes battery electric, plug-in hybrids, and fuel cell electric vehicles. It also put a flag in place for a multi-pollutant standard for medium and heavy-duty vehicles, beginning with model year 2027, as well as fuel efficiency standards. The infrastructure package that was recently passed by the Senate has several key provisions to advance zero-emission trucks and buses, and shows dedication to enhancing domestic production of vehicles, infrastructure, and component parts. For example, there's $2.5 billion dedicated to funding zero-emission school buses, $7.5 billion for the build-out of charging stations along highways and in rural and pollution-burdened communities, over $6 billion for programs to support a domestic supply chain for battery production, $750 million for advanced energy manufacturing and recycling, and $5.25 billion for low and zero emission transit buses and associated infrastructure, as well as money for reduction of truck emissions at port facilities. Reconciliation is also ongoing right now. It remains to be seen when and how exactly all of reconciliation process will shake out, but there are several key provisions already on the table. And this includes $170 million to reduce diesel emissions, including $120 million for low income and disadvantaged communities, $5 billion for clean heavy duty vehicles and infrastructure, and tax credits for new and used plug-in electric vehicles and commercial electric vehicles. Next, I'll talk about some policies for consideration. We'll note that ambitious targets are a promising start, but they won't succeed without a suite of complementary policies that underpin these goals. And of course, equity must be a common thread of all policies. This means ensuring that low income and communities of color disproportionately impacted by harmful air pollution are prioritized and that members of the community have a seat at the table. Some standards that states can look to adopt. I've noted that they're California standards, but of course, any state can and should adopt these. This includes the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule, which my colleague Jenny Helfrich will talk about later, the Heavy Duty Omnibus Rule, which will cut nitrogen dioxides by 90% below current standards, the Advanced Clean Fleets Rule, which accelerates the market for zero-emission trucks and buses by requiring fleets that are well suited for electrification to transition to zero-emission vehicles where feasible, and the Indirect Source Rule, which will phase in over the next 3 years and aims to combat emissions from truck traffic associated with warehouses. Some complementary policies that all states should consider are financing solutions, so a variety of mechanisms to help break down barriers presented by the still high costs of infrastructure and zero-emission trucks and buses themselves. Infrastructure deployment. EV deployment won't grow to the extent necessary to meet critical targets unless there's sufficient infrastructure placed in the right locations, including in disadvantaged communities, as a way to support these vehicles. Vehicle grid integration in order to make sure that fuel cost savings are preserved to the extent possible, as well as ensuring that vehicles are integrated into the grid in a way that helps to minimize the build out of grid infrastructure. And of course, marketing, education, outreach to disseminate the information about available rebates and incentives and the benefits of these vehicles. Finally, I'll talk about a few New York policies that are on the table. This includes, of course, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, one of the most ambitious climate laws in the world that sets greenhouse gas targets of 40% below 1990 levels by 2030 and 85% by 2050, as well as a goal for 100% of zero emission electricity by 2040. Assembly Bill 4302 requires all sales of new passenger cars and light duty trucks in the state to be zero emission by 2035 and sets a target for all medium and heavy duty vehicles to transition to zero emission alternatives where feasible by 2045. Of course, New York is a signatory to the memorandum of agreement that was put together by the Northeast states for coordinated air use management, setting a minimum target of 30% of zero emission truck and bus sales by 2030 and 100% by 2050. And then, of course, this is not limited to statewide actions. As the biggest urban center in the state, New York City has its own ambitious plans, including GHG emission reductions of 40% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels and 80% by 2050. As well, all New York City school buses are slated to be zero emission by 2035. The city plans to transform its fleet to electric vehicles by 2040. And the Metropolitan Transit Authority that operates in New York City has a goal to transform all 5,800 buses in its fleet to be zero emissions by 2040. So that is a very brief and very high-level overview of some of the policies at play on a federal and state level. And now I will turn it over to Jennifer to talk about a deeper dive about the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule.
Great, thanks Larissa, thanks Mary, glad to be here today. A couple caveats. One, I might have some connectivity issues, apologies in advance. And then the second is I know I'm going to talk really fast because I have limited time and I have a lot I want to cover. So my name is Jenny Helfrich. I'm a senior manager for the state policy program at Ceres. I lead our work in Western states and also our cross-state clean transportation work, which a lot of it recently has been around the Advanced Clean Truck Rule. So a little bit about Ceres first. We run the BICEP Coalition. That's over 70 major companies, folks like Salesforce, Mars, Lyft, Owens Corning, eBay, Fortune 500 consumer-facing brands you would recognize. These are folks who have set some significant greenhouse gas reduction goals, and that's because they see climate change as a long-term economic risk that impacts their employees and customers and disrupts their supply chains. So we help them advocate on climate, clean energy, and clean transportation policy that helps them meet their climate and financial goals. We also run the Corporate Electric Vehicle Alliance. That's over 20 major companies and fleets. These folks have set ambitious targets around electrifying their fleets. It includes Amazon, DHL, and of course, IKEA. Stephen's on the line with us here today, and many more. So part of the long-term economic risk that I mentioned earlier, that's an underlying factor for folks wanting to invest in electrification. Another part of it is they want to do right by the communities they work in and for. And then a big chunk is that they want to unlock the savings that can come from electric vehicles. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The primary reason that these companies formed a coalition is that they are finding it difficult to acquire electric vehicles. They want to buy them, they're starting to transition their fleets, and they cannot find the EV models that they want in the places where they need them. So enter the Advanced Clean Truck Rule. So what this rule does, the Act sets annually increasing sales targets for truck manufacturers. That means that it requires a certain percentage of their sales to be zero-emission trucks. And then that percentage increases year by year, moving faster for segments where the technology is already cost effective, which is the case for a number of medium heavy duty trucks. By requiring truck manufacturers to sell a certain percentage of zero emission trucks, the Act rule will help our companies get access to the models that they've been struggling to find. And importantly, it will accelerate innovation and investment in the sector, which will help create economies of scale and unlock associated cost reductions, which is really what we need right now. So we know that 5 states are moving on the Act: New Jersey, Washington, Oregon, and Massachusetts all plan to adopt by the end of the year. New York, hooray, and Colorado are looking to adopt next year. We know a few more folks are thinking about it. We've been working with companies, investors, and institutions that want to see these and more states adopt the Act. In fact, we'll be releasing a major company support letter as part of a Climate Week event this Friday, 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. Stephen's going to be on that event also. He's one of our top advocates in this space. Please join us if you can. Feel free to email me after this for details. So a little bit about why companies support the Act and electrification. It's not just about model availability. Obviously, from a business perspective, they want to capture the savings. There is a growing business case for investing in electrification. EVs generate significant savings over the life of a vehicle through reduced maintenance and lower, more predictable. That's important because unpredictability is a problem, a risk that companies have to plan around. So lower and more predictable fuel costs. This is already the case for light duty fleets and most medium duty trucks, and it is becoming more and more the case for heavy duty trucks. In fact, there's a number of total life cost analyses that show this. One in particular I want to highlight found that with supportive policies, an electric long haul truck already offers up to $200,000 a year, in savings over the lifetime of that truck. So the technology is already here. Beyond savings, mitigating climate change and the significant economic risk it poses is also a major priority. As Mary mentioned, transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the US and in most states, and it's one of the only sectors that's still growing. So we need a 78% reduction in annual US transportation emissions if we are to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. Our companies know that medium and heavy duty vehicles are a disproportionate source of these emissions, as Mary mentioned. 5% of vehicles on the road, 25% of overall emissions. That's extraordinary. Finally, and most importantly, our companies are making health and air quality a priority. They know transportation is one of the largest sources of air pollution, creating a significant and costly public health burden that is disproportionately shouldered by the low income and communities of color. EDF worked on some recent analysis, which found that transitioning to 100% medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicles in the US by 2040 would lead to cumulative pollution related savings of $485 billion by 2050. That translates to a very real human benefit in avoided asthma and heart attacks, as well as lost days of work and school. So just quickly to conclude, companies know climate change poses a significant risk to their business. They want to improve the health of their employees, customers, and the communities in which they operate, and they see electrification as a major economic opportunity. We're seeing companies support the act because strong policies are essential for decarbonizing the transportation sector at a pace and scale that the private sector cannot achieve on its own. By adopting the act, states are sending a clear, long-term economic signal that is necessary for the kind of market transformation we need. So I'll stop there. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jenny. That was a great overview and link to the businesses. And so now let's hear from a couple. Steve, over to you.
Sure. So I'm Stephen Mulk. I'm the project implementation manager for IKEA's zero emission delivery ambitions here in the United States. And that is part of a larger global goal to provide all of our customers with zero emission home delivery by 2025. So a pretty ambitious goal worldwide here. One of our biggest challenges is the fact that we don't own any trucks ourselves. And in fact, the third-party logistics companies that we outsource our transportation to, they don't really own trucks either. These trucks are typically owned by independent contractors or contract carriers who are kind of smaller mom and pop operations that usually buy their trucks on the secondary market. So, and just to kind of give you an idea of some of the scope of this issue is that in the Department of Transportation says that about 90% of delivery companies are less than 5 vehicle fleets, have fleets less than 5 vehicles. And in fact, the top 500 owned fleets in the United States only make up about 10% or maybe even less than 10% of the total commercial vehicles that are on the road today. Add to that the average urban delivery route in the United States is about 80 miles. And so the technology for battery electrics can easily accommodate the ranges that we're talking about, but the fleet availability and getting access to those fleets for small businesses has been a challenge. The way that we've tried to tackle that problem is by implementing a rental model where we work with a rental company partner to provide access to electric trucks for these contractors to use on a very short-term basis, daily or weekly. But even then, we are, there's a limited number of vehicles to offer these contractors in the segments that we're operating in. So while the rental model makes us kind of OEM agnostic, which means that we can test out any vehicle that we want to on the platform, having more vehicle choices. And as Jennifer said, kind of spurring that technology on and reducing cost is all extremely helpful, which is why we support the ACT rule and other rules in this in that space. But not only does it reduce the cost and increase investment in the technology, but it also kind of starts the clock on the secondary market as well. So, what we look forward to is for these kind of rules like the Act, or like some of the things like Larissa had mentioned, the indirect source rule and other policies to implement charging infrastructure to help enable these kind of small fleets to acquire their own trucks eventually and stop renting from us and be able to kind of show up on a day-to-day basis with their own trucks. And for these logistics companies, these large logistics companies that we outsource to, for those guys to put zero emission delivery on their menu of services for not only us, but for other, other customers that purchase their transportation, which is pretty much every company except maybe a few large ones that we know of. So that's really the goal of our program, not only to push our own transformation, but to kind of democratize the zero emission delivery for everybody and push our transportation partners into that space as well. So that's a little bit about us, and I will pass it on to James, I think, right?
Yep. Okay, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Mary. I trust everybody can hear me. James Sherman here, Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of Climate Change Mitigation Technologies. We are a electric truck and bus fleet project developer and manager headquartered in northern New Jersey. And we work with public and private fleets to get them into electric trucks. We are partnered, my company, with Hudson County Motors in Secaucus, New Jersey, United Ford, where we deal the BYD and Lightning electric trucks. We have right now class 3 through 8 electric trucks. Any truck that you could buy in diesel, we now have for sale in electric in classes 3 through 8. We have several on the lot. We have them in inventory. Anybody who really wants an electric truck can have one right now. And that's the first thing people need to know. There's a lot of talk in the marketplace about how electric trucks aren't ready for prime time. With specific respect to New York City, BYD Class 8 day cab that hauls all this stuff out of the port, it has a 250-mile range right now, the extended range. So can easily make several trips from the port down to exit 8A and back per day, or from the port over the GW Bridge to the Hunts Point food market and back several times a day. All this stuff is in our range. Also the last mile delivery, the Lightning E450 box truck, that goes 120 miles on a charge. Now with the faster high-speed chargers, we can do opportunistic charging. Our company, CCMT, we develop the project. We go out and we find the right fleets and the right communities, and we bring the whole package together, from the trucks to the chargers. And now we're even starting with solar and storage and completing the green energy loop. I would just say, with respect to climate change in New York City, I was former assistant counsel of the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. And that's how I got my start in mobile source control with the New York City program. And here I am 25 or 30 years later. Anyway, Mary asked me in this intro phase to just give you an idea of the types of projects and trucks we have either out on the road or on order. And then I'll get into a little more of the business, how to make this all happen, and some of the policy matters during the Q&A. But right now, we've delivered this summer 10 heavy-duty BYD terminal tractors to the Red Hook Container Terminal in Port Newark. These are used to move sea containers around the port. It's a perfect application. They work perfectly. They return at night with a 62% state of charge. We have automated charging control systems on it, telematics. Have not had a single problem. The fleet's been operating 2 months. They love it. And the drivers love it. The air conditioning works, and we have a USB port so they can plug in their phone and listen to tunes and drive the truck all day long. We are now in the process of delivering the first ever heavy-duty battery electric garbage trucks to Jersey City. These are 3 Class 8 25 cubic yard trucks, and I believe 2 of the Class 6 10 cubic yard trucks that you might see, the New York City Parks Department driving around in Central Park or the Brooklyn Park. And so these trucks are now arriving, or they are in operation. Those were our Volkswagen Round 1 projects. And in Volkswagen Round 2, we have 33 medium and heavy duty trucks on order, and they run the full gamut from yard tractors to Class 8 day cab that's going to be driving up and down the New Jersey Turnpike every day. We have a number of E450 box delivery trucks with reefer units on them for the Elizabeth Board of Education. Elizabeth Board of Education is one of the largest in New Jersey. They move a lot of food around to the schools. These will be used for that. We have type A and B school buses on order, which we're working with a local bodybuilder here in New Jersey that puts on the bodies. A couple of these will be vehicle to grid equipped. And we just have just about every manner of truck that anybody who's looking for one could get. We work with probably 8 or 10 municipalities in New Jersey. We have another 5 or 6 private fleets. Then we're also engaged in a very interesting e-mobility project with the residents of the Ironbound section of Newark. Most of these people don't have a car, incredibly expensive to take a $40 Uber ride 2.5 miles to go shopping in Kearney and have the Uber guy wait and come back. And so with the Ironbound Community Corporation and residents, we now are going to be starting up an e-mobility project where we're going to have a fleet of Lightning E450 buses that will take people either to work, the graveyard shift down at the airport, or to local businesses during the day to go shopping, supermarkets and whatnot, other stores. So we are engaged at every level. We have every type of vehicle. We do all the charging infrastructure, and we take the fear factor out of it. And what I'll get into later on, and as we get into the discussion, is some of the emerging business models that allow all this to go forward right now. And that's charging as a service, energy and charging as a service, and now transportation as a service, which is everything but the driver. And we have all these business models in various stages of development. It's very exciting because this is what I think will break the logjam for fleets, big and small. Steve wants to democratize. This takes the huge upfront capital cost out of the equation and lets the whole thing happen. This has been the problem in this industry, is the cost of the vehicle, which is 3 times the cost of a conventional diesel. With transportation as a service, you overcome that, you overcome the fear factor, and we can do this at scale. So I'll be looking forward to talking more about that and answering everybody's questions. And that's what we do. We do it every day of the week.
Great. Thank you, James. And thank you, all of you. A great start. So sort of to bring together kind of our discussion of policy and the businesses that you're leading. I guess starting with Steve and James, when you think about the current business model that you're working on and these other ideas, which we will get into a little bit, when you think about policies like the ACT, in your minds, are there others, like based on the challenges that you face every day as you're doing this, are there other policies that you think really that government that can really help to get this, to keep priming this market, to keep it going? Steve?
Yes, sure. I mean, first of all, almost all of these policies are beneficial, right? So the ones that Larissa spoke about and Jennifer spoke about. The ACT is fantastic, for all the same reasons that we just spoke about. lowering cost and driving innovation. It also helps drive other financing models that James was just talking about, because it puts people more at ease that like the larger manufacturers are getting into this, and so financing becomes more available. And vehicles as a service, fleets as a service starts, those types of models start to emerge, which is great for everybody, because everybody's use case is like a little bit different. But I would also say the indirect source rule, the one in Southern California, Larissa touched on it. That's a powerful motivator for landlords, industrial landlords, to kind of start to think about the vehicles that are showing up at their property, which is, for the first time, kind of pulls the landlords into this process, because a lot of the industrial distribution centers and warehouses are not equipped with chargers today. And so this gives those folks some incentive to start installing chargers, which kind of allows for, as kind of a precondition for electrifying your fleet, is to have those chargers there. And for smaller fleets, or for third-party logistics companies that rent from these landlords on a shorter term basis, having those chargers there is a precondition to electrification. So I think that's a really strong one. Other things that people have tried, green loading zones. I'd like to see more zero emission zones in urban areas and stuff like this, the kind that we see like in China and in Europe, because that kind of creates its own demand in those areas that kind of pushes people into that market. So I think those are good. I'd like to see some government support for residual values of vehicles. There was a white paper that came out a little while ago talking about kind of insurance for residual values and supporting those residual values, which would help again with financing and help again with offering lower cost leases to folks. So I think that there's a lot that we can do in those spaces.
Great. James, before I ask you to speak, I wonder if Larissa or Jenny want to just add some meat to the bones of what Steve was just talking about in terms of the ISR or loading zones, where we are with some of that outside of California, or more what it is even.
Jenny, I don't know if you wanted to go first, but happy to talk a little bit more about what the indirect source rule is and how it operates. So this is a California rule that's spearheaded by an air quality management district in the South Coast, so the southern part of California. And it'll be phased in over the next 3 years. It applies to warehouses within that air quality management district that are 100,000 square feet or greater, and is really designed to combat emissions from truck traffic that is attracted to the warehouses. So hopefully the rule is expected to reduce smog forming emissions by about 10 to 15% from warehouse related sources, i.e. These trucks that operate at the warehouses. And it operates such that the operators of the warehouses have to have a certain number of points and offset those points. They accumulate those points by acquiring zero emission vehicles and other activities like that will proactively reduce the emissions from the trucks coming to warehouses.
Great, thanks, Larissa. Yep, Jenny.
I just was going to layer on that the zero emission delivery zones is a little bit of a new idea that I know some cities are looking into. And the way that it works is and it started, I think, in Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator. And what they did is they looked at, they have partnerships with companies that make deliveries and then with the city. And they kind of set out a couple of blocks where everybody agrees they're going to try to only do zero emission there. And the goal of that is to give everybody kind of practice runs with what it would look like to have what they call last mile, package and food delivery be just zero emission, and what that means in terms of infrastructure and support from the city to try to make that happen. So it's a great kind of like no penalty, voluntary approach to try and get things moving faster at a very local level. I also just wanted to layer on some other ideas to what Stephen said. The low carbon fuel standard, I think that maybe Stephen mentioned, is a very good way to help drive investment towards electric vehicles. There's also the Advanced Clean Fleet Standard, which California is in the process of developing, which is a complement to the Advanced Clean Truck Rule. And it says, hey, manufacturers, you're developing these zero emission trucks. Well, fleets, we're going to ask you to buy them. And so it kind of helps create that push and pull. And the big issue in this industry is it's a chicken and egg, right? Where's the charging? Where's the truck? You got to start somewhere. And we're trying to get all parts of that ecosystem to work together to get there. And that's what these policies help with. And then finally, there's the medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicle MOU. 15 states have signed on to that. What it does is it sets out timelines and targets for decarbonizing the medium and heavy duty transportation sector. And then the states are working on developing an action plan, which is kind of a choose your own adventure of policy approaches to reach those targets. Whether or not a state joins the MOU, it is extremely valuable for the executive branch to set out those timelines and targets as a market signal that everybody, whether they're on the supply side or the purchasing side, can gather around and work together to achieve.
Great, thanks, Jenny. James, anything to add in terms of when you look at your business policies that would really help?
Yes, Mary. The policy right now that I think is extremely critical is actually in order before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It's FERC Order 2222. And this is an order that's been issued that directs all the regional transmission companies and the ISOs to incorporate distributed energy resources like electric trucks and vehicle to grid services as much as possible and make it available in their service districts in the PJM. And I think ultimately it comes down to the local electric distribution companies. The business models that we're working with, energy and charging as a service and transportation as a service, the basis of it is being able to, excuse me, generate vehicle to grid revenues at some point over the life of the vehicle that will allow us to front the cost and absorb that and lease it at a low monthly rate over time. But the bedrock of the whole business model is the ability to use the batteries to generate vehicle to grid revenues when they're otherwise not being driven around. Now, that's most of the time. A lot of the fleets we deal with, they're parked at 3 o'clock and ready for the afternoon ramp. This is when electricity is most expensive. This is when you can arbitrage electricity. This is when you can sell frequency regulation service to the grid operators. And with that revenue, companies are now ready to move forward and offer such things as transportation as a service. But that's the basis of the model. I don't have to tell anybody on this phone call that, electric companies are not known necessarily for speed or innovation, but that's exactly what we need is speed and innovation. And we need to have all the electric companies, not just in New Jersey and New York, but around the nation, fully embrace their responsibilities under FERC Order 2222, because that allows the floodgates of capital to be released into the marketplace. And then we can offer transportation as a service and overcome the high capital cost, but also the fear factor. Once you get a fleet owner used to the fact that he's about to buy a very expensive electric truck, then you tell him, oh, well, there's even more expensive or equally expensive infrastructure and charging and project managers and electrical contractors. That becomes very difficult. But with vehicle to grid, we wrap all that together. We take the fear factor out of it, and it all flows from a vehicle to grid marketplace where the electric utilities are fully cooperating and implementing FERC Order 2222. So I think that is another extremely important policy, regulatory, whatever you want to call it, that everybody on this phone call and all these organizations have to really, jump in and, get serious with the utilities about.
So that has me thinking we could go in lots of different directions. So one is the interplay between federal, state, right? And then you've opened up the utility piece. So I don't know, does anyone want to comment more on sort of first with that sort of the interplay between federal and state policies?
Yeah,
issue 22 specifically.
Yeah, I don't know, Mary, I wasn't going to talk about the FERC order specifically, but I'm happy to talk more broadly about the federal and state interplay unless one of my colleagues wants to talk more about that. But I think there's this slightly unfortunate perception by some players in the space that it's an either or kind of thing, like either state should move or the federal government should move, and state should wait for the federal government, but it's really both. It's a yes and kind of thing. And I think that's true for a few different reasons, and states have a critical role to play here. So first, it's important to remember that federal standards, these are the multi-pollutant standards that I referenced earlier, even if they're finalized by the end of next year, they won't be implemented before 2027, model year 2027. So there's an important gap for states to fill. And failure of the states to act, I think, will really leave critical emissions and health benefits on the table, which can help a lot of people, particularly in pollution burden communities. Second, states can push the federal government to continue moving forward by showing clear action and ambitious action. I think they can act as a lever to make sure that the federal government acts on its promises. And then third, it's important to remember that state standards are durable. So as we saw with the Trump administration, there was an unfortunate rollback in a lot of important standards, and states continue to hold fast and show forward momentum. And if that happens again, they can continue to play that role.
Jenny?
I would just layer on that, in the case of something like the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, there is no equivalent federally, and they're also not really thinking about something like that. The closest thing might be a multi-source pollutant rule, which would look at the emissions and requiring a reduction in emissions from future vehicles as a way to encourage the sale of zero-emission trucks, which is just not the same as the Act, which is specifically a market-forcing tool for zero-emission trucks, which is kind of what we need in this area, and also for charging. I said earlier that it's like a chicken and egg problem in this industry. It's really hard for any particular piece to go first because there's so many different pieces that you need to have in place. And even with some of the questions I saw in the chat around, well, what do we do about charging and what about batteries? They're really important questions. And there's a lot of people who are working on, we have some solutions in the hopper. The thing is, we're just not at the scale yet where we can even begin to tackle these questions, right? Like we need to rapidly accelerate the scale, both for the deployment of charging and for zero-emission trucks, before we reach a point where we can have the kind of scale for talking about what to do with the batteries and how do we meet the charging need in a way with the grid, whether it's grid upgrades or installing, utility scale storage, or how we're going to do it with renewables, whether they're utility scale or local. Like we're not ready to start talking about those questions yet because we don't even have enough trucks and charging out there. So this, the chicken and egg question is what's been the major hurdle so far. And the Act is like, okay, whatever, chicken and egg, let's get something started to get this process moving. And that is hugely important and is going to help bring all those other pieces along.
Great. Steve, do you want to add anything to this mix?
No, that was pretty good. That was
Okay. Well, that kind of leads me, again, there's so many directions we could go. Infrastructure, charging, right? So and you've all just laid out how important a piece that is in the chicken and egg. So can we talk a little bit about the utilities and where the utilities fall in this momentum that we are building here. And would love to hear from all of you, and specifically from Steve and James, would love to hear how you're actually working with the utilities now
Right.
to get these trucks on the road.
Well, I think that the part of the challenge with first of all, the utilities, all the utilities we've been working with thus far have been great. They're all very supportive of our EV initiatives and everything else. I think part of the challenge internally for a company like IKEA is that we've got 50 stores around the country, and you're probably dealing with about 50 different utilities. And so there's not a lot of like harmonization on some of these programs. And so, and all of these programs, which are great, they require our legal department to take a look at. They have all kinds of different stipulations and rules and requirements. They have to be public facing. They can't be public facing, but they have to be of this nature or that nature. And so all of these things make it difficult for a business like IKEA to just roll out a standardized plan for charging infrastructure. So and then someone had even mentioned to me a while back, well, you give this form over to your grants team. And as big of a company as we are, we don't have a grants team that works on just trying to get grants from utilities or anything like that. And so there's really, there's not a lot of bandwidth for that type of thing. Like I said, that said, it's, everybody's very supportive, but it is difficult to kind of wade through the different rules and things when it comes to these different incentive programs with utilities. I would also say that like infrastructure, like Jennifer mentioned, is so important, and it's a precondition to doing a lot of this stuff. And depending on where you are and depending on what utility you're dealing with, the wait times for utility upgrades are quite long. And so I'll take charging wherever I can get it. If we think we're going to need 6 trucks, we might as well put in 10 chargers, that kind of thing. You might as well get as much charging infrastructure in the ground as you can before, otherwise you're waiting in line. It's not something that's easily adjusted like midstream. So, I think those would be kind of things that we're learning about our infrastructure.
Great. James, what about you and your experience with the utilities?
Yeah, sure. Let me just say first off that in most instances, like we start off with starter sets of like 2 or 4 vehicles to get people going. Oftentimes that doesn't require a service upgrade. When you get to 10 and 20 and 50 trucks, then you need a major service upgrade. But we've been able to get started without a whole big charger to do. The utilities are exploring this, learning this, building the airplane, I guess, as they're flying it. What Steve says about the delay, if you do need a service upgrade, it can be very lengthy. In New Jersey, Mary, as you know, the straw proposal has proposed that they put in the upgrade and they have 1 year to do it. I think that's reasonable. In our VW grant programs, we have to deliver the trucks and the charging systems within 1 year. I think that's just a reasonable time in which to get things done. So you do have to work closely with them. It's difficult, quite frankly. They're so large, they're so disparate, and they're trying to figure it out themselves. So it requires all of us to constantly push against the utility. But here in northern New Jersey and in the New York City area, if you have 480 volt service, you can put in some pretty big fleets, and you don't need fast charging technology. As I say, that's where you get into big currents, big voltages, big amperages. The BYDs, we charge them overnight using a 40 kW AC charger, no problem. It's on a timer, managed charging software, goes on at 8 o'clock. Those puppies are ready to roll the next morning at 6 o'clock. So, to get started, and in a lot of situations, especially private fleets in the New York City area, it's just not that big a deal to get started. If you want 50, then we're going to have to do a major infrastructure project. But if you want 2 or 4 or 5 and get rolling, you can get rolling today. So, that's sort of my answer. We just happen, it's Climate Week. It's Climate Week in New York City. We're just blessed being in the densest place in the earth. I understand northern New Jersey is denser than Calcutta. So it is, heaven for the electric drive duty cycle. We can go up and down from exit 8A into Hunts Point Market all day long, no problem. We don't have to charge. We don't have to fast charge. So I just want to, make that clear to everybody. Mary, what I do want to say in the last minute here, and then I'll share the microphone with everybody else. I've been known to talk too long. Everybody in the family says so. The emerging business model is very simple in our mind. There's 3 players. They each have a piece. The federal government or the state government should be subsidizing the incremental cost of the vehicle, period. The utility should be doing the make-ready infrastructure from the pole to the pad, period, done. And then all these charging companies and fancy, vehicle-to-grid stuff, those guys can then come in and offer energy and charging as a service, transportation as a service as a service, you name it. And that's it. I think about this every day, and I know everybody else does, but we try to think about it simply. And if the federal and state governments are paying the incremental cost on the vehicle, the utilities doing the make ready, then the private sector can do everything else, come in, drop down the chargers, operate the vehicle to grid, and do transportation as a service so that we can overcome the very high capital cost and get big guys and little guys into some electric trucks. So there you go.
Great. Thanks, James. I like how you bring us back to really, it's not that hard. I mean, it's hard, but let's just find the simple steps and stay focused on them. Let's turn to some Q&A that we've got from the folks in the audience. Deborah, I think I can see them, so I'll just go through them. Someone asks, understanding that the tailpipe emission is a huge contribution to GHG. However, are we addressing the GHG associated manufacturing of the battery production and mining of the raw materials of the batteries? And also, is there intended regulation regarding how to recycle or dispose of the batteries? Anyone want to take that? There's a lot there.
Yeah. I can start, and of course, invite all of my colleagues to weigh in as well. But I absolutely agree. It's a huge thing that we need to tackle. What do we do with the batteries? How do we reduce the GHGs from the manufacturing? And we've seen this in the global south, that emissions are rising because of lithium mining and other component parts of these batteries. And I'll just say that a couple things are in play, because I think this is very much at top of mind. We've seen in the infrastructure bill and reconciliation a lot of money set aside for exploring just these issues. So looking at better manufacturing in the component parts of those batteries, and and citing them more and more in America to oversee those emission reductions. Recycling grant programs to assess the viability of second life batteries. And I know in California, there's even a dedicated program that is just being started by the California Energy Commission to explore lithium mining in California as well. So there are a lot of things that are already in play to explore these issues, and I'm at least cautiously optimistic that we'll start to figure this out, because I agree it is something, when we look at the full life cycle emissions, that we need to consider.
Thanks, Larissa. I see a question in the chat I'm going to go to, because I think it's totally relevant to today's panel. And thank you. Great discussion on a critical policy, the ACT. Could you comment on the primary opponents to this policy, and what are the most common myths and misunderstandings that you encounter in your work? Jenny?
Sure. Unfortunately, some of the primary opponents have been from the trucking and manufacturing industry. And some of the, so part of that is understandable, right? Like, there's a lot of fear that being required to sell zero emission trucks means that they'll be creating a product that no one will buy. Whereas those of us who work on the buyer side, like IKEA, and those in the production side who have a lot of buyers, like James, know that there's a huge market for this, and folks are actually begging for additional models and having trouble finding them. So that itself, I think, is a myth. And then there's the fact that I mentioned earlier, the Advanced Clean Fleet Rule is a policy that's designed to help address that concern by matching purchases with what they're going to be producing. So hopefully states that adopt the act will also consider the Advanced Clean Fleets Rule. And then, to be honest, there's a little bit of fear mongering around what's going to happen with the rule itself and with jobs. So first, with the rule, California is considering a goal for 100% zero emission truck sales. And folks like the Engine Manufacturers Association have started to tell states that that means the act rule might change, that there's uncertainty around it, that they'll have to require the 100% zero emission trucks goal. None of those things are true. The act is set. The option to adopt the 100% will come up in the future, and it's not a requirement. The other piece around jobs, that one's a real issue, right? If we're transitioning an entire industry, of course, we're going to see changes in who the manufacturers are, where the jobs are, and who's doing those jobs. And so we definitely need states and the federal government to be thinking about some strong industrial policy and just transition support, where we're trying to focus investment in new manufacturing within the same places where there already is diesel and gas truck manufacturing, and retraining folks for those jobs or helping them transition out of the industry and into another one. And that's something that, you know, where there are ways to realign costs and fees so that zero emission trucks have a level playing field, and we see some fees that are appropriate given their public health impact on diesel trucks, that those fees then funnel back into the communities that are going to be most impacted by this transition, and make sure they're supported there.
Great, thanks, Jenny. I think we have time for another question. We're coming down to the end. What happens to the ICE trucks when a company transitions to EV? Anyone want to take that?
Well, under the VW consent order, they had to be destroyed. It was a 1-for-1 trade. For every electric truck you got, you had to destroy a diesel. Now, in New Jersey, under the new NJEDA program, you do not have to do that. You can retain your existing diesel or gas, which actually counterintuitive as it sounds, is actually okay in getting the market moving, because it's one thing to have a guy buy an electric, but then to tell him he has to immediately retire something that, you know, he invested in and is making him money, and you know, that is a big problem. So, you know, I can see it either way. Some programs require 1-for-1 replacement, others do not, and I'm on an indifference curve there.
Great.
Yeah, on the scrappage rules that you're talking about, James, you're 100% right. Like the VW one requires the scrappage of a vehicle, and I have not been in favor of those scrappage rules for exactly what you just laid out there, James, because companies that had invested in newer technology find it difficult to find an old vehicle to scrap necessarily, because they've already eliminated those from the fleet years ago. And so the requirements for scrappage being these kind of older trucks, the newer fleets, which are the ones that want to buy these electric vehicles to begin with, don't have the old vehicles to scrap. And so to answer the question from the question itself, which is like what happens when you transition, the reality is the vehicles kind of work their way down this kind of life cycle, and they go into the second life and the third life and so on and so on. But you have to kind of start somewhere and kind of get this going. And as the electric vehicles start to enter the secondary market, you're going to see that kind of accelerate. And so or there's other states, I think, are considering modifying those scrappage requirements, allowing newer fleets to buy older vehicles off of the secondary market and then turn those vehicles in. So you don't have to actually have them sitting in your yard or be utilizing them, but you can just dip into the secondary market, pick up one of those old vehicles, and then scrap it for the benefit. So you are taking a vehicle off the road that way.
Great. So I realize we are over time, but I apologize to everybody, but I would love to give each of you, just a quick moment to sort of finish off, give us your final thoughts. Jenny, can we start with you?
I've shared so many thoughts. I'm not sure I have many more.
Well, that's fine too. That's fine too.
Yeah, I'll just say, I think this has been a great discussion, and that my ending point is really that a lot of companies support the advanced clean truck rule. And so for states that are thinking about it and that aren't there yet, and also for New York, as you go through the process, we're ready to stand behind you, and companies want to speak up in their support to show you that you're not alone. Thanks, Mary.
Great. And I didn't mean to put you on the spot, so I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but if you'd like to give a closing remark, please do.
Yeah, I'll just close quickly and just say that I think the discussion today has really shown that ambitious zero-emission vehicle, truck, and bus targets are achievable, and that states can and should move forward with those targets and the complementary policies necessary, including the advanced clean trucks rule, to meet those targets, and to ensure that it's a holistic sort of mean that we go about this in a holistic way that includes all like fleets and utilities, and make sure that it is done in the most equitable way possible.
James or Steve?
Well, I would just say that you should put in an easy pass lane for electric trucks on the GW bridge. And if you own an electric truck, you go right through that thing, no traffic, whatever. And that's what really kills the truckers, is the time waiting in traffic. They have to make 2 or 3 turns. There are low-cost solutions like express lanes for EV trucks over the GW bridge. You'd be surprised how that could move the market and things like that. But I think we're here, Mary. I think we're at a tipping point. Tipping points come very quickly, and you don't know you're there until you're tipped over the side. We have tremendous interest from big, medium, and large fleets. It's here. It's real. Do not believe the incumbent diesel truck producers.
Yep. I would say that exactly, listening to this discussion, there's a lot of questions out there. Should it be state? Should it be federal? Should we have battery? Should we have charging? Should we have small fleets or large fleets? But the reality is that we just need to act, right? We just need to go forward. And that's been our philosophy. And, we can't let the good be, the perfect be the enemy of the good here. And we just have to move forward on all fronts as fast as we can. It is an iterative process. There will be some challenges from time to time, but we do have to move forward. So deploy, deploy, deploy.
Excellent. We will leave it with deploy, deploy, deploy. I want to thank the panelists. What a great group. Thanks for being here today, and thank all of you for joining us. And thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.